Okay, we're now live, Amrita.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the fifth in our IDS series on inclusive trade. In our discussions on inclusion, better understanding and operationalizing inclusion for engagement with and from international trade, today we will be focusing on a very critical element of inclusion, which is gender. International trade and gender equality. When we think about this, there's a two-way relationship here that one can sort of discuss. Gender equality, gender inequalities create challenges often for engagement with international trade, participation in global value chains. On the other hand, international trade can also have impacts which are gendered in nature. So there's this sort of two-way relationship that we can think of. When it comes to international trade, increasingly gender inequalities are being considered, and there is this increasing narrative about gender mainstreaming in trade agreements. And so I'm really pleased today to welcome Amrita Bahri with us. Dr. Amrita Bahri is a co-chair professor of the WTO chair program in Mexico. She's also an associate professor of law at ITAM University, as well as a trade and gender consultant with the International Trade Center. Welcome, Amrita, and thanks so much for joining us today. Amrita will be giving us today her presentation about trade and gender, focusing specifically on gender mainstreaming in trade agreements. Without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Dr. Bahri, but just to add that we also have two discussants with us, Teresa Carpenter, who is an economist at Inter-Analysis at the University of Sussex and a research fellow at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. Also with us today is Dr. Fred Zanku, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research in Ghana and our dear longtime colleague. So welcome everyone. And I'd now pass to Amrita for giving us this outline on trade and gender mainstreaming in trade agreements. You're on mute, Amrita. Yeah.
Sorry. We are 3 years down the line and it's still the famous cash line. Thank you so much, Amrita, for this introduction. It's the first in line for me, an event where the moderator is my namesake, and we're two Amritas in the same panel. So a pleasure. Can you see my slides? Wonderful. And can you see them change? One sec. Yes? Excellent. Great. So my plan for the next 15 minutes or so is to share with you some thoughts, some reflections from my research on this narrative on gender mainstreaming in trade agreements. Why are we trying to mainstream gender in trade agreements? Why do we need gender mainstreaming in trade agreements? Why do trade agreements work? And why can trade agreements serve as a powerful vehicle for correcting the gender imbalance that we have in the society, in the world, in different countries today? And then eventually in the second half, talk about, once we have looked at the problem, once we have looked at the solution in the form of trade agreements, talk about whether these trade agreements can really work for different countries with different conditions. Because an important insight, an important finding that we've seen in the last few years, especially in the last 1 decade, by observing the trends of gender mainstreaming in trade agreements, is that mainly developed countries have advocated this approach, right? So if you look at who the front runners are, if you look at who the pioneers of this approach are, most of them are developed countries. And developing countries, and there are majority of developing countries that are yet to take their very first step in this regard, right? So they haven't signed or negotiated a single trade agreement with a single commitment on gender equality or women empowerment. So why is that, right? So that's where we'll try and, get to the other side of the table and see if they really work, right? So first thing first, what is the problem? The problem, of course, is gender equality. And here by gender equality, I would like to refer to cisgender inequality. Because gender in itself is a broad concept, right? So here we are talking about the differences in opportunities and access of resources between men and women. And there are various studies that have already shown to us how women face more formidable, more disproportionate barriers than men when it comes to accessing economic opportunities, when it comes to accessing market opportunities for them. And these barriers have only increased, the impact of these barriers have only magnified in the last few crises that we have witnessed together. And it's not just the crisis of global health pandemic of COVID-19. We've seen in the last 3 years when the COVID started, and we've seen a number of studies talking about how COVID-19 has placed women at the front line of the struggle by imposing disproportionate impacts on women more than men. But it's not just limited to COVID-19. Now that we are looking at other crises, including war, supply chain disruptions, inflation, and natural disasters, right? We realize that it's not just the health pandemic, but it's the crisis and the nature of the crisis that causes a disproportionate impact on women. And it's unintentional, of course, but it is there because there's a huge gap in access to resources and opportunities between women and men. So what do we do? How do we go about solving it, right? Of course, we can either employ the bottom-up or the top-down approach. So we can either try and make changes at the domestic level, make tweaks in the laws, legislations, regulations, procedures, behavioral changes at the domestic level. But that could take some time, considerable amount of time, especially in a few regions where there may not be political will or general will to bring about a change. And the other way is top-down. And the top-down approach basically advocates for using international frameworks, international policies, international conventions, and agreements to incentivize this change at the domestic level. And this is the approach that I've tried to explore, where I have sought answers from trade agreements as to how these trade agreements and whether these trade agreements can be made to work for both men and women. Because a huge length of literature, a huge length of scholarship has shown to us how trade liberalization and how trade policies can have unintentional discriminatory impacts against women and in favor of men. And trade agreements can work because they are, at the end of the day, negotiating instruments. They are negotiating instruments which can be used both for diplomatic as well as substantive reasons in favor of gender equality. The substantive reasons are clear. You all know them by now. McKinsey, World Bank, list goes on. They've all repeatedly in their studies have shown that gender equality is no longer a moral good or an ethical good to have. It's now become a business case. Right. So these studies have shown how by 2025, world economy would get richer by some 20-25% and more productivity and whatnot in the global economy if we achieve gender parity. Then these numbers may not stand now, given that we have these crisis-like situations, but still, there's a clear business case to it. But there are reasons beyond substantive. bidirectional relationship between trade and gender. And those reasons are diplomatic in nature. As we go ahead, we are realizing that there are several countries which are still not comfortable with the notion of trade and gender in the same sentence, but they're still going ahead and assuming provisions, accepting provisions in their trade agreements on gender equality. And that is being done for various reasons. I can think of 3 reasons right away. 1, the ease that comes with it when they want to negotiate with countries that are pioneers in gender mainstreaming. So the ease of negotiating with countries like Canada and UK and New Zealand and Australia, which are countries that want to include gender-related commitments in pretty much every trade agreement they negotiate. The second reason is the precondition. European Union Parliament has adopted 2 resolutions, 2 recommendations, whereby they have assumed commitments, they have assumed obligations on including a whole chapter or a significant proportion of commitment on gender equality in every single trade agreement they sign in the future. And these recommendations were adopted by the Parliament, I think, back in 2016 and then eventually in 2018. So they are recent, but their impact would be shown in the forthcoming agreements that we will see EU coming up with different trade partners. And the third interesting reason is that some countries have used these provisions as negotiating chips, as bargaining chips. And I can think of the case of Mexico, for instance. When Mexico was negotiating USMCA with Canada and US, there were a few issues, such as the technical barriers to trade and the issues on steel and aluminium that they wanted to negotiate and have their agreements on. And labor was, of course, it's the elephant in the room. And it was at that time when Mexico probably used a standalone chapter, the idea of the proposal of having a whole standalone chapter on trade and gender added in USMCA as a negotiating chip. Because if we look at how the negotiations took place, including a whole chapter on trade and gender in USMCA was proposed by Canada initially, but then Canada eventually backed out. Right? They dropped on this idea because they realized that it's not going to happen, and US was staunchly opposed to it. But Mexico carried on with the agenda. And here, Mexico, we are talking about a country that had not signed its previous trade agreements with any provisions on trade and gender, except EU-Mexico. So yes, these negotiating instruments can be used as chips to bargaining, as instruments to simplify the negotiating experience, and as vehicles to improve social conditions, including gender equality in these respective countries. Now, here in this map, you can see a couple of things going on. The color code tells us which regions so far have included the maximum number of gender provisions, legal provisions relating to women empowerment, gender equality, and such concerns. And we clearly see that there are 3 regions that emerge as leaders in this respect. Right? We see that Canada is quite forthcoming. It has added, especially in its new generation trade agreements in the last few years, has added as many as 10 or 15 legal provisions in their trade agreements and their side labor agreements. We see that European Union has added gender equality related provisions, explicit gender equality related provisions in more than 50% of their trade agreements. And East African countries have, of course, led this game because they have several trade agreements that talk about gender equality provisions in different ways. Another interesting thing to note here is that different regions and different countries have added and talked about women's concerns in various ways. So there's no one trend which is emerging when we talk about gender mainstreaming. They've all adopted different strategies and different approaches and different focus areas, if you look at it. I mean, North and South America have clearly gone for a purely economic and market access approach, right? They've talked about access to education, digital skills, promotion of women's business skills, reservation for indigenous women who are engaged in cross-border trade and services, access to markets, access to finance, and so on and so forth. But when we go down and move to Africa, especially East Africa, we see that this focus changes. This focus changes from purely economic and market-oriented to women as representatives. As these agreements on the continent have focused on women's role as decision makers in politics, policy making, and so on and so forth. So East African community, for example, has a very powerful provision that talks about ensuring gender balance in legislative assemblies, including the East African Parliamentary Assembly. And the interesting finding is that ever since this provision and this agreement was negotiated and implemented, the number of women parliamentarians in East African Community EAC Parliament have gone up by more than 50%. So yeah, does gender mainstreaming work? I don't know if we can still answer it, but there are some initial evidence. There are some initial examples that support the case of gender mainstreaming. But when we move up to Europe, we see a contrast. We see a different approach. Because Europe has mainly focused on protecting lives of women in conflicts and violent situations, access to maternity services, health services, equal pay for equal work. And another sort of contrast can be seen when we move to North Africa and Middle East. Because these countries have plainly and only focused on the role of women as mothers. Because all the provisions that you see in their trade agreements talk about child care, mother and child protection, family planning, and so on and so forth. So we clearly see a demarcation in different focus areas that different regions and different countries have employed. And these focus areas and these provisions, the content of these provisions, as you can see on these slides, directly talk to the barriers that women face. So there are two questions that we are really trying to answer here. Do the current trade agreements have the potential of helping women overcome the barriers? I would say confidently the answer is yes. But are they achieving the purpose? Is the question here. There are some 300 plus trade agreements as per the WTO's recently launched trade and gender database, in some 100 plus trade agreements that have at least one explicit gender related provision. And when we look at all of them, we realize that broadly speaking, there are 6 categories, 6 roles of women that these trade agreements are trying to focus on. Their role as representatives and decision makers, as employees, as social and cultural actors, as business actors, contributors to economic development, and mothers and consumers. But amidst these wide range of approaches, even though we classify all of them as gender mainstreaming in trade agreements, we find three commonalities. First, most of these provisions that we have looked at and that we've talked about are best endeavor promises. So they're all drafted with permissive soft verbs, soft verb constructions. Countries may, could, can, endeavor, seek. And funnily enough, sometimes countries have gone ahead to use hard words like hard verb constructions such as shall, but they would combine shall with endeavor to, right? So these provisions so far, or countries so far, have not developed the appetite to accept these provisions as binding commitments. And I used to say that previously as a criticism, but no more. Because the more I'm getting into the subject, the more objective I'm getting, I think, because there are reasons behind not accepting these provisions as binding so far. Second, most of these provisions, with very, very few exceptions, and the exceptions are extremely few, are left outside the scope of the agreement's dispute settlement mechanism. So they're completely non-enforceable. And countries have assumed these ambitious list of beautiful Cinderella promises without giving any thought on how they would go about implementing them. So what contact point, what unit, what committee, where would they find the money from? We're talking about huge, significant resources. When we look at the kind of promises made in these trade agreements, increasing women's access to education, increasing women's access to financial resources. Just 2 of the other 10 commitments found in the most recent trade agreements are hugely resource intensive. And that may not be a huge problem for developed countries, but it becomes a massive restriction for developing countries that may not have the kind of resources to implement these promises. And the lack of definition. No trade agreement except EAC that defines gender defines gender equality or women empowerment. And we know that these words, these concepts are as broad as they can get, as broad as, I don't know, like products in Article 20 or public morality in Article 20. So we as trade lawyers, as trade law community, have already seen the kind of problems that are associated with including these major concepts and expressions without attempting to define them. And that causes fears, speculations in the mind of countries, especially when they're trying to negotiate with countries which are at a very different stage or level of development from them. But it's probably done intentionally. Because when it comes to assuming, and this is where I will conclude, when it comes to assuming and when it comes to accepting legal obligations which are concrete and binding in nature, there are various problems that countries can have. There are various impediments that countries can face. First, there are countries that still do not have the expertise and understanding on how trade and gender relate to each other. There are countries that do not believe that there is a relationship between trade and gender, and countries have gone ahead to say that trade agreements are about trade and trade liberalization. They're not about resolving social issues. We are sovereign nations who have the power and rights to resolve social issues at a domestic level. There are major challenges as well. Beyond the lack of understanding and beyond the lack of awareness and belief as to whether trade and gender can actually work, there are broader issues such as the fears of protectionism, the fears of cultural imperialism, fears that more developed countries can use such provisions in a protectionist way and to reduce their comparative advantage or impose their own moral standards on the other countries. What can lead to moral, and that can all lead to moral imperialism concerns. What may be morally right in your country may not be morally right for mine. I think one of the cases that I can think of to show this contrast is the EC sales case, right? So in EC sales case, the legitimacy was given to animal welfare concerns as a public moral concern, and both the WTO panel and the appellate body subordinated the moral concerns of the indigenous sailing communities in other countries to those of, I don't know, the EU's animal welfare concerns. So here's just one example to show how a vaguely defined value such as public morality can lead to such concerns of protectionism, or sometimes even at the cost of destroying comparative advantage of a country in a particular industry. And then this problem of high cost and low probability of compliance. There are certain countries which may have the willingness and appetite for such inducements, but they may not have the capacity to do it. And that increases the cost of complying with these legal obligations for them. But then there are other countries that may have the capacity, but not the willingness. And therefore, the cost of probability of compliance may be very high for them. So there are these barriers that we need to look at. There are these very legitimate challenges that we need to look at. And plainly, there's lack of data. We still don't have sufficient evidence to show whether gender mainstreaming works. And developing countries don't have the capacity to gather the kind of data to observe the differential impact of trade liberalization and trade agreements on both men and women in different industries, in different economies, in different markets. And without this data and without the capacity to gather this data in the future, it is just not possible for these countries to assume legally binding commitments. And that brings me to a fundamental question, which is, again, do trade agreements have the potential to increase gender equality? Yes. Are they, and can they do it? Is probably something that we need to talk about, and I hope in our discussions and questions round we can get some more meat and food for thought. But thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Amrita. That was a really thought-provoking presentation. I think this has been really useful in thinking through some of the on-the-ground challenges of why we are not sort of getting to better grips with this issue. And I'm sure our audience has several points or questions from you. But what I'd like to do now is to invite our discussants before I also add my questions in there. So first, I'd like to invite Teresa Carpenter. If you'd like to add any points, any questions, and your reflections on Amrita's presentation.
Okay, thanks, Amrita S. For the introduction, and Amrita B. Thank you for an absolutely brilliant presentation, captivating. Your students must adore you, because I was just gripped by absolutely every word. I really enjoyed that. And before that, I enjoyed the slides. So whether I have any more meat, maybe not, but I think I'd like to just step back a few paces and maybe help with the framing. I think that's where I can maybe add something. So if the problem is gender equality, then the answer is social change. Is trade policy a key instrument in social change? Maybe not. I don't think any of us would be advocating that it should be or could be. But given that trade policy is not the main way that gender equality can be tackled, what should trade policy do? And trade agreements, there's two options. They can either ignore it, which is what they have happily done for the mainstream and mainstream trade economists and trade lawyers for quite a long time, or they can include it in this best endeavours kind of way. And including it like that is not really a new thing. It goes back to the Treaty of Rome in 1956. And I just want to share a small anecdote. I was 10 in my country, a developed country, the UK, when there was a lot of discussion about the Sex Discrimination Act, as it was called, back then in 1975. And this was a completely new, revolutionary for the UK back then idea that men and women should be paid the same amount for the same jobs. And partly it comes from the feminist struggle, but partly it also comes of the fact that the UK had decided to join the European Economic Community, and it was there in the Treaty of Rome. So through something that got put one little line in the quite short Treaty of Rome back in 56, 20 years later came this legislation in the UK. Do we have gender equality in pay right now? No, there's still a gap. In every country, there's a gap. In some countries, it's bigger than in other countries. But did that line in the trade agreement help? For sure. It's just it wasn't particularly quick. And I did note that you said, do they help? And you quite clearly said yes. And you said, are they working? And I think the answer there is not yet. Now, I'm not at all advocating for patience, it just takes time. It's 40 years ago, there were colleges in Oxford that women couldn't apply to. I'm not advocating for patience. I'm just saying that if it does take a long time, that's what we should a little bit expect, and especially how you've explained all the large resource constraints that the developing country partners would need if they actually really wanted to implement these. I mean, suppose you had a legislature in one of those countries that said, right, how do we do this? And let's put a cost on it. And politicians do sometimes come out with one-line policies. For example, we mustn't pay too much for our energy bills in the UK, again, as an example, and then that comes to be a huge amount of commitment for government. So I can understand that it's not necessarily going to be fast. And I'm not saying be patient, I'm just saying we should anticipate that it will take long, that it might not be quick, but we should just put those lines, like if we are negotiators, if we are academics advocating, we should continue advocating for those, in terms of words, small clauses in these agreements, because later there might be some women who come after us that can actually use those and insist on the implementation of those words. And if what we're really talking about is social change, just that it's not necessarily going to happen fast, and trade policy is not going to be one of the, it might not even be one of the major things, but might it help? For sure. And since that's what we work on, should we do it? Most definitely. And I wanted to just go back to your title, like, is this a Potemkin facade? So let's just go back to what the Potemkin facade is, which you didn't explain, and I did have to look up. So the Potemkin facade, in case anybody didn't Google the title in advance, it comes from a kind of a half myth, half legend, half truth back in Russia, when the Queen of Russia was traveling around, and her helpful courtiers, in order that she would not see this dreadful poverty that the serfs lived under, and the people before the Bolshevik Revolution, so that she would be shielded from this terrible poverty, they would erect these facades around the roads so that she would think it was a beautiful village. And these kind of things are still used in cinema for shooting movies. You just put a facade up and you don't have to build everything behind it. You don't have to build a whole building on a movie set. It's just a facade, and that's okay. Now, the thing about the Potemkin facades is that those facades were never intended to be filled in and built behind them. And if we want to go with the construction analogy, are these clauses about gender in trade agreements? Perhaps they're not Potemkin facades, perhaps they're cornerstones, which are defining a building that's going to be built in the future. It's not necessarily something that we're going to come up with in our analysis in 1 or 2 or even 5 years' time and say, look how that worked. But these are cornerstones. And if we can play our part in laying those and advocating for those, then I think that I see these as cornerstones, not facades, because they are commitments that can be seen as the beginning, and that there is going to be something built on it. And I think I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. That's really interesting perspective. I'm sure Amrita has reflections on that, but let me now also invite Fred to add his points, after which I'll pass back to Amrita.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amrita, for that very insightful presentation. And after that, and the comments from Teresa, I don't know what more to add. So I wish I went first, but anyway, I'll try. So I have a couple of comments and perhaps of questions. The first is looking at whether the whole idea of achieving gender equality through trade agreements may work better for some sectors than others, or for some countries or types or groups of countries than others. Is there any evidence to suggest that there could be differential impacts of using this instrument as a way of achieving gender equality? I'm not so well versed in that literature, but it would be interesting to see if using this instrument could achieve different outcomes for different sectors of even an economy, or different blocks. I think you mentioned, you gave a few examples using those graphs, what's happening in different parts of the world and different areas. It would be interesting to unravel that a bit more. Now, you know, as somebody from a developing country, from Ghana, anytime I hear about using, you know, agreements in general or law to achieve an aim, broadly speaking, including gender equality, I become a bit skeptical, not because we shouldn't do it, but because I become less optimistic about how that can achieve what we need to achieve fast enough. You know, I can see that maybe in several years to come, several decades to come, but how do we achieve gender equality through trade as fast as possible, as fast as we can? And in thinking about that, you know, I just feel that because of our experiences in other sectors where we have so many nice, beautiful, agreements and laws. But if you were to analyze those and to see its impacts on the intended targets, they don't seem to work very well. And therefore, I would say that in addition to that, to the agreements, it would be good to look in the area of trade about how we build the capacity of women to play the game, even given the status quo that we have today. How do we increase the capacities of women using various instruments? So basically, I'm saying that, and I'm not saying that you are suggesting that using trade agreements is the only way, but I'm saying perhaps that in looking at how we can use these agreements to achieve gender equality, we have to combine them with a number of other instruments, including ways of building the capacity of women to compete. And growing up, when you think about trade at our local level, we think about women. When you mention trade, in West Africa in particular, in Ghana, you think about women because women are the cornerstones of trade, domestic trade, but even intra-regional trade, especially in food and agricultural commodities. And yet, even for those women, the benefits of trade, including international trade, are unevenly distributed among them. So it's not as if promoting trade in itself, yes, it may increase the, if you look at gender, you look at men and women in aggregate, the gaps could reduce, but looking at even women as a group, there is high inequality in how the capacity to participate in trade leads to the outcomes that are desired. So even we have to focus looking at women, different groups and classes of women, and what kinds of trade, agreements or trade policies can promote equality even within the gender. So because there is, when you come to Ghana and also in West Africa, there is a lot of talk about how so-called market queens reap all the benefits from trade, and that most of the benefits do not get to women at the local level. So the women who are doing the production, the women who, but a lot of the benefits tend to accrue to other groups of women. So looking at men and women is fine, but we need to also look within the gender and see how we can make the benefits of trade more equally distributed in that sector. And one of the things that comes to mind when you talk about international trade, women and equality is in Ghana is particularly factory work. And one of the things that have been raised by some colleagues of mine here at the University of Ghana and elsewhere in Africa is the decency of the jobs. How decent are the jobs that are created through some of these agreements that are reached through international trade? I can give an example of even the garments sector in Ghana, when we had agreement with the US, the AGUA at that time. So you have a lot of entrepreneurs coming to Ghana and other countries to set up industries, so you get women employed, but they work under conditions that, even though you could say that trade has promoted, has led to an increase in employment, it doesn't necessarily always lead to decent jobs. And so the kind of jobs that these trade agreements create also would be an area that would need thinking a bit deeply about. So I will stop there with those comments. And thank you very much for this insightful discussion.
Thanks a lot, Fred. If you don't mind, Amrita, I'm just going to add a summary of points which link to some of the questions that have come through. I mean, I think you gave us a lot of food for thought. Are trade agreements, or can they be negotiating instruments? And how? I think the point about how is something that we have been able to nuance. And I think 2 points, and this relates to some of the questions, is that there are 2 levels here. Of course, there's the domestic policy, and that links to the international agreements. What is it that we can achieve at those 2 levels, but what are sort of the intersections of that? How is there systematic evidence which can tell us, maybe as Fred was saying, for specific sectors, how can we sort of work in combination? I understand, of course, the data challenges and the challenge of systematic evidence, but maybe that's something to kind of think about further. Another point which I think came across when all 3 of you were speaking, and there's a question here, which is, I think I'll also add my point here, is that there's, of course, what we are looking at today in terms of trade negotiations, in terms of the sort of intersection of trade and domestic policy. There is a current status quo that's probably sort of a short-term perspective, and within that there are intersections between, so let's say, gender and class, for example, the example of Ghana that Fred was giving. But there's also a question about more structural, more dynamic change. And maybe, I think you covered this, Amrita, in your presentation, but as Teresa pointed out, does that require maybe a longer time frame? So some of those things that we are seeing entering trade negotiations, maybe they don't work now, but they require a more longer time frame. So over to you. I think you have a sort of job at hand, sort of summarizing your responses. Sorry for that, but yeah, thanks a lot, and over to you, Amrita, for your response.
Sure, thank you so much. So definitely, I have a tough job and very few limited minutes. So let's see where we get to. And again, I think more than answering your questions, I'm going to raise more questions to all of us, and that's an initial warning to begin with, because these issues are quite complicated, and we still don't have answers to them. So let's reflect. Teresa, thank you so much for your feedback, for your comments, very thought-provoking comments, and for clarifying the definition of the title. And my intention of using Potemkin Façade as in the title was to really try and have a deep dive towards the other side of the table. That is a terrain which is quite new for us so far. For us, meaning for the gender mainstreaming advocates in this field. And I agree with you that these gender provisions, to a large extent, are maybe not these facades, but more of cornerstones, because they are a beginning. They are starting to something important, which probably we talked about as a social change, or as Amrita mentioned, as structural change from a longer perspective. And I also agree with you that we need patience for them to result in structural changes. But my problem here is, and that's why the use, that's what justifies the use of the expression facade, is that there's a real risk of them becoming the former, the facades. Mainly because patience is not enough here. It's not enough to just wait and watch whether they're resulting into something concrete. Why? Because there is a problem with the way gender provisions are drafted in these trade agreements currently. I have serious concerns and serious questions. If these provisions and these long list of promises are making their way into trade agreements, always as cooperation activities, never as legally binding obligations, always unenforceable, meaning that non-compliance with these obligations would not have any impact or any consequence of on their relevant parties. And more so, even though we are not prepared to accept them as binding commitments, I have serious concerns on them being added without any effort to locate where the resources would come from and which unit or which actor or which procedure would be responsible for their implementation. I don't see how these provisions or these promises would ever be put to action or would ever result in a structural change without giving any thought on enforcement, implementation, their meaning, what the definition of these terms is, and the resources required. And that's the problem that I have here. And that's why I think we need to change the way they are being drafted to ensure that they remain being cornerstones and not facades. Fred, you posed a lot of questions for me, but thankfully you answered most of them. And you also provoked a lot of thoughts in the way where you asked, okay, what are the differential impacts of these agreements, of these instruments? And there were two examples that right away came to my mind. One is NAFTA, the previous USMCA. There are some studies in Mexico and US that have shown how NAFTA has had a differential impact on women and men. And if you only look at how NAFTA has impacted women in Mexico, we find various positive and negative impacts. So on one hand, we see that after signing NAFTA in 1995 in Mexico, female employment went up quite considerably in the economy. However, as you rightly pointed out with Ghana's textile example, that has led to what feminist economists refer to as feminization of labor. More jobs, but at the cost of low wages and poor working conditions and more exploitation. Now, is that a positive change? Probably yes, for women who may not have any other options to earn their livelihood. But it's coming at a cost. And the second example is Rwanda. With the signing of COMESA and EAC and these trade agreements, there are several countries, including Kenya and Rwanda in Africa, that have massively increased the representation of women in their decision-making roles. If you only talk about Rwanda, female parliamentarians in Rwanda's parliament have gone up by 60%. 60 in the last, what, 12, 13 years? That's a huge change. And I'm not saying that there's a clear but-for connection between the signing of these agreements and the increase of representation. All I'm trying to say is that this could be one of the contributory factors in there. And there's a growing skepticism on gender provisions in trade agreements. Can they really achieve the purpose? Can they really achieve the results? Can they really increase the capacity of women? Are these big questions that you posed? And I think the answer lies in the way in which we conceptualize and draft them and include them in the future. One most recent example is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Here is an agreement that includes gender equality references 3 times in the entire agreement. First in the preamble, and front-loading a gender equality commitment in the very preamble of the agreement means something, because that impacts the way the entire agreement can be interpreted. Then in the objectives clause of the agreement, and then finally in the protocol on services, where they talk about increasing women's business capacities in services, in trade and services. So here we are talking about countries, 54 member countries in Africa, taking upon them a commitment to increase the business potential of SMEs and women-owned SMEs. And now the new player in the scene is the protocol, the AFCFTA protocol on gender and youth, on women and youth. Here is this protocol that 54 member countries are trying to negotiate. And of course, it has two different chapters, youth and women, but the chapter on youth, but the chapter on women can potentially be a game changer. Because we understand that these trade policy instruments have had differential impacts. There is no argument in the understanding that these trade agreements have had winners as well as losers. So we want to ensure that in the future going forward, the negative impact on the losers can be minimized as much as possible. And the AFCFTA protocol on women can be a game changer, because by including commitments on the barriers that women face in the continent, the barriers that you precisely mentioned, Fred, in the informal sector, because most of the women, for instance, in the continent work in the informal sector, need to be realized, and accordingly the provisions need to be drafted. So to conclude with, Amrita, your question, structural changes, do we need a longer time frame? We cannot wait and watch. There are problems with the way we have talked about gender provisions in the trade agreements. They may not work, so we cannot wait and watch. And the solution is not patience and observance. The solution is to bring about real changes, concrete changes in the way they are drafted in the future.
Thanks, Amrita. I think that gives us sort of optimism and hope for what's next and how this sort of narrative needs to go forward. I think I agree with you that, you know, a lot of this needs to be immediate, but probably with also oversight of sort of the longer term picture. I think on that positive note, we can now thank you for your time, as well as for Teresa and Fred, as well as everybody joining us online. Thank you so much. I'm sure this discussion and these questions that we have raised and have just sort of thought about today can be continued in different ways. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this Inclusive Trade Seminar Series, and we will continue in I think a couple of weeks, but also in various ways, as well as I think there'll be discussions at the public forum next week. Thank you all very much. Thanks, Amrita. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye.